Tonight on Primetime Politics, Budget Day in Ottawa. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. The federal government is finally giving some structure to the promises it's been making for months. Today, tabling its first federal budget, the first for Mark Carney since becoming Prime Minister, and the first budget in more than a year.
Budget 2025 is a plan to catalyze investments from provinces, territories, municipalities, Indigenous communities, and the private sector. With this plan, in 5 years, we will enable $1 trillion in total investment in this country, Mr. Speaker. Enable $1 trillion of investment.
As promised, the Carney government is making massive investments with this economic game plan. $115 billion for infrastructure for the next 5 years, $110 billion for productivity and competitiveness over the same time period, with $30 billion for defense and $25 billion for housing, again, both over a 5-year time frame. And as expected, the price tag is hefty. Take this year's deficit alone, not the $100 billion some economists were predicting, but still higher than the $70 billion the parliamentary budget officer had warned about. When it is all tallied for fiscal 25 to 26, the deficit is projected to reach more than $78 billion, with the debt expected to clock in at $1.35 trillion. And when you look at the deficit as a percentage of GDP, it now sits at 2.5%, more than the projected one when the Trudeau government tabled its last budget in April of 2024. Well, with that, let's now go to the foyer of the House of Commons and join CPAC's Andrew Thompson for a deeper dive into the numbers. Good to see you, Andrew. You've been going through the budget document, and I wanted to begin here with the deficit and deficit projections, because I think there are a couple of things to note. First, where the government sees the country's finances going, and second, the fact they make it very clear that there is a distinction for them with this year's budget.
Okay, Michael, well, let's start with that deficit. $78.3 billion this fiscal year. That's $36 billion higher than what we saw in last year's fall economic statement. And if we look over the next 5 years, the shortfall is going to average about $65 billion. The product, yes, of more spending, but also a weaker economic outlook because of Donald Trump's trade actions. However, the government has that fiscal anchor it wants to hold on to, a falling deficit to GDP ratio. And yes, as promised, the government has split up its spending into two. On one side, capital investment. On the other side, day-to-day operational spending and revenue.
Okay. So let's stay with the government's operating budget, because that is where the government is expecting to achieve savings in this fiscal year and really in the next 5. In fact, it does help form a financial guardrail for the Carney government. Tell us more about that.
Yes, the government's other fiscal anchor is to balance this operational side over the next 3 years. The government wants to show responsibility and restraint while also investing in the Canadian economy. So this budget has a big drop next year in the operational deficit, from $33 billion down to $8.7 billion, eventually getting to a $2 billion surplus by 2029.
So where does the government expect to find these savings?
Well, over 5 years, there's a promise to find $60 billion in savings and new revenue. This includes reducing the workforce by some 16,000 full-time equivalents. That represents about 5% of the current public service, and the government is hoping that most of this can come through attrition and early retirement. The overall goal is getting the public service to shrink by 10% compared to its peak size a couple of years ago. Now, as for other savings being promised, here's a few examples: indexing RCMP disability benefits to inflation, cutting back on foreign aid spending, and ending the program to plant 2 billion trees. Though it should be said, Michael, that some departments do not have to cut as much. The Department of Defense, Women and Gender Equality, Indigenous Services, and Crown Indigenous Relations.
Andrew, thank you for that. And yes, those departments don't have to cut as deeply. Andrew Thompson in front of the House of Commons, the foyer of the House of Commons on the Hill. Well, listen, as we continue our coverage this evening, we also want to note that the Liberals are now one vote closer to getting the support they need to pass this budget. This is a minority parliament. The government was 3 votes shy of a guaranteed win. But this evening, Nova Scotia MP Chris D'Entremont announced he had left the Conservative caucus and was now joining the Liberals. In a statement, he says the following: Prime Minister Mark Carney is offering that path with a new budget that hits the priorities I have heard most in my riding, to build strong community infrastructure and grow a stronger economy. That is why, he says, I'm joining the government caucus. After 5 years of serving in opposition, the people of Acadie, Annapolis, and all Canadians know that the moment we face today needs all of us to lead, not with complaint, but with confidence in a strong future. Well, with that, take a look at the reaction on the Hill as members of the press gallery ask questions of the Prime Minister about this floor crossing.
Prime Minister, Conservative MPs are talking about crossing the floor to your government, sir.
Man of the moment.
Floor crossing to your government. What do you say to that, sir?
A budget that everyone can support. A budget for the country, for the moment. This is generational. Couldn't be prouder of my finance.
We're ready. We're ready.
Okay,
An investment budget, des investissements générationnels. We'll meet the moment.
Well, to talk about his budget is the Federal Finance Minister, Minister Champagne. Thank you for joining us.
It's a real pleasure to be with you.
So in looking at your budget, there seems to be 2 threads of criticism. The first one has to do with your tax measures, whether or not they have gone far enough to encourage investment in this country. We've heard business groups saying this is a start, but not enough, and you are going to need private capital to build this economy. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, I would say, honestly, if you look at the marginal effective tax rate, which is really what distinguishes, if you have to make an investment between different jurisdictions, whether you're looking at that level, we are going to be more competitive than the United States in terms of taxation. So that's the first thing. So people who are looking and say, where should I allocate capital in North America? Canada is the clear choice. That's the first one. And if you look at the productivity super deduction, I mean, this is something that business have been wanting. If you're a small business tonight, this is really good news, because the moment you invest now in plant equipment, in automation, in buildings to make sure you can manufacture in Canada, you have immediate expensing. I mean, this is like a game changer for entrepreneurs to supercharge their investment. And that's why I would say this is well done. The SHRED program, which is really that program for research and development, 60% of small business are using that. You know what they were asking us? Not only to make sure that we do what we had announced to enhance the program, but they were saying is making it more efficient. We've listened to them. We've said today, you know, before you had to make the expense, apply, and wait 2 or 3 years to see if it worked. Now you will be able to be pre-clear. So in a sense, you'll send what you want to do, and we're going to give you a response so you can go ahead with certainty and predictability. That is what business have been asking us to do. And I would say the tax deduction that we have, plus the investments tax credits that we have, makes Canada by large the most attractive place to invest. And
okay, let me jump in. I hear what you're saying. I do want to jump in, though, because at this point, the Conservatives say they will not support your budget. The Bloc Québécois says they're not willing to support your budget, though the Bloc is willing to speak with you. The NDP is also willing to speak to you. I understand Chris D'Entremont has now crossed the floor and is now with the Liberal caucus, but you're still a couple of votes shy. Are you willing to sit down with the NDP or the Bloc to make amendments to your budget to ensure that it gets passed?
Well, I would say there's something for every Canadian in this budget. What I wanted was to reassure Canadians this is an investment budget. This is a generational shift. I would say we need to seize the moment. I think Canadians have little patience now because they see the challenges ahead of us, affordability. There's a lot of uncertainty. You know, what we've seen in the world is probably the largest shift in terms of speed, scope, and scale that we have seen since probably 1945. So I would say to the opposition party, you really have to ask yourself if that budget is fit for Canadian. why would you not do the right thing and make sure that this budget passed? Because at the end of the day, the measure, think about what we're talking about, small and medium-sized businesses. Talk about protecting our sovereignty. Talk about investing in housing. Talk about the program we said that we're going to have a health infrastructure fund for hospitals and clinics across the country. You're going to say to Canadians, I'd rather not vote in favor of that.
Well, from what we heard, Minister, that is exactly where the opposition parties stand right now. And without amendments, your budget does risk failing and bringing down the government. Are you willing to sit down with the opposition and revisit this budget and make amendments?
Well, I would say they should read the mood of the nation. The mood of the nation is clearly not for an election. The mood of the nation is to say the people in Ottawa should come together and make sure that we can do the investments that are needed because they are generational.
So where do you think you'll get the votes then, Minister?
Well, I'm talking to everyone, and I'm willing to talk. We've been having discussions before the budget. We have things which are very specific. And by the way, a number of things you see in the budget is what the provinces and territories have been asking us to do. So we have responded to that. We have made sure, imagine even you talk about who's supporting. The Canadian Labour Congress said that budget, the measure announced, are putting workers at the heart of Canada's economic strategy. This is pretty powerful. If I was the NDP, I may want to listen to what the union said, because they said that the measures we've put together are putting workers at the center of our economic strategy. So if you look at that, if you're the Conservative, you say you would really be not supporting our defense investment to meet our NATO target, to make sure that the men and women who serve in uniform would not have the funds required to have the technology and the equipment. And if you're the Bloc, you're looking at that. One thing that that the province has been asking is to say, give us a hand on health infrastructure. And we said we're happy to do our part. So that's my point, is that there's enough in this budget for every party to say, listen, it serves the people that I represent. Because at the end of the day, every member of parliament here needs to ask in their soul whether this is something that's going to be good for their constituent.
Minister.
And that's the question that they have to ask themselves.
Minister, thank you for this amount of time, but really appreciate the time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Always a pleasure.
And you.
Thank you.
Well, with that, let's bring in now Jasraj Singh Hallan, the Conservative Shadow Minister for Finance. Jas, thank you for joining the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Listen, the deficit, when you look at this budget document, it clocks in at over $78 billion. The budget shortfall is nearly double the ceiling that your party was calling for. But when you listen to the government, they make this argument that this is investment that's needed to recharge, to recalibrate the Canadian economy in the face of Donald Trump's trade policies. How is this money not justified?
Look, Michael, any family today that was looking to see lower grocery costs when they go to the grocery store, anyone that's seen their mortgage or rent doubled in the last 10 years because of failed Liberal policies, or anyone that's tired of seeing the increase in crime, they had no hope, and there's nothing in this budget for them. And believe it or not, the deficit is even higher than what Justin Trudeau had. And for someone who's a so-called banker and a great money manager, it's impossible to fathom that someone who calls himself a budget expert is going to spend even more money than Justin Trudeau. These are the same failed policies in the last 10 years that sent 2.2 million Canadians into a food bank into a single month, 700,000 which are children. And there's nothing in this budget to give those families reprieve. And just like the public budgeting officer had said, that it's easy to say that it's capital spending, but the definition is so broad, it doesn't define anything. Anything can be an investment or a so-called investment in there, but spending is still spending. Debt is still debt at the end of the day.
Spending is still spending, although when you look at this document, that you have the government here showing a clear a downward trend when it comes to operational expenses, what they're trying to do, and they argue that this is essentially for recalibrating an economy that has been hard hit by Donald Trump and will continue to be hard hit by Donald Trump. I understand what you're saying about affordability, but we're talking about recalibrating the economy. Is that not a priority?
I didn't see that part inside the budget, and the reason why I say that is because Mark Carney, remember, he advised the UK last year to do this exact same accounting trick. The parliamentary budgeting officer talked about this accounting trick as well, that said it kind of muddies the waters on what things get defined. So, you know, it doesn't go to say that there's real investments. At the end of the day, if you look at the track record of this government, it's been disastrous. And that same advice that Mark Carney gave to the UK, this accounting trick was disastrous for them as well. True investment would be if it came from the private sector, but this government has driven away almost $600 billion in Canadian investment to the U.S. because of anti-energy laws and all their bad policies that they've had in the last 10 years. What the government actually really needed to do in this budget is just get out of the way. Get out of the way, get Bill C-69, the No New Pipeline, out of the way, so private investment can come in and build, so we can create better jobs.
Let me jump in. Let me just jump in because we're quickly losing time here. But we do have a government now signaling that's willing to drop the emissions cap, also willing to move the target for an emissions-free economy to 2050, as Danielle Smith has been calling for. Are those not things worthy of supporting?
Until Bill C-69, the new pipeline bill, the Bill C-48, the industrial carbon tax, until those things don't go away, things cannot get built in this country. And that's what we've seen over the last 10 years. Because of those laws, things just aren't getting built. Investors are fleeing from Canada. And since Mark Carney has become Prime Minister, $50 billion of Canadian investment has fled, because when you're an investor, you look at where there's lower taxes, a better business environment, and the Liberals have made sure that that environment is not in Canada. That's why so much has fled from here. Those anti-energy laws that the Liberals put up, those obstacles that are in the way of a good investment, those need to go away. That's how we'll get our product to market. We'll become an energy superpower and become more independent on the world stage.
Now, my understanding is that your party, your caucus, will not be voting for this budget. This is a minority Liberal government. It needs at least 3 more votes. And we're now getting word, and this is not news to you, that Chris D'Entremont, your former colleague, has now left the Conservative caucus. Is your party in danger of losing more members to the government and getting this budget passed?
A true Conservative won't be able to vote for this budget that does not bring down the cost of housing, that doesn't bring the cost of the out-of-control food inflation that's happening under the Liberals, or the fact that everything has just become more expensive. And for us to support something that a budget that literally is going to make life more expensive for Canadians, when more and more Canadians are lining up at food banks in record numbers, would not just be irresponsible, it would be the wrong thing to do for Canadians. We had 3 demands for this budget. They were very simple. Keep the deficit below $42 billion. Get rid of the hidden food taxes that the Liberals have brought in, including the industrial carbon tax, which is going to increase, the food packaging tax, which adds on $1 billion, and get rid of Liberal inflation tax. None of those things happen, and it would be irresponsible on behalf of Canadians to vote for this budget that's going to make life more expensive.
Jasraj Singh Hallan, quickly lost time there, but thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, as you heard there from the Conservative Shadow Minister, he does have concerns about the deficit. And earlier today, I did speak with Kevin Page. He was Canada's first parliamentary budget officer. These days, he is the president and the CEO of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy. That's at the University of Ottawa. And with the federal deficit projected to average about $64 billion for each of the next 5 years, I asked Mr. Page if this budget was fiscally prudent.
We need this capital investment. We need to start moving goods and services more east-west than north-south. And that's going to come at an enormous expense, and that's going to take time to build, which I think, one of the questions for Canadians is, can we wait? Are we going to be impatient with respect to this type of measure? In this sense, this budget is very different than other crisis budgets.
Build on that. How different is it?
So I think in 2008 we had a global financial crisis. We immediately went into recession. I think Canadians kind of understood that we need to do something to protect households and businesses. For the most part, we protected businesses. In 2020 we had a global pandemic, and we basically told people to stay at home, and people said, okay, the government has to help us out. We bailed out households and businesses. Now we're dealing with a longer-term shock that feels like our sovereignty is being threatened, economic sovereignty. And we have to realign our economic relationships with other countries. And that comes at a cost. And I think, so we're getting, the government is trying to find the right balance. I think there were some people thinking we could have saw deficits closer to $100 billion. And now we see deficits peaking at 80 and declining to 65. And again, I think if we can get to an operating balance, and we could say in 2028-29 that the only deficit we're running in this country would be about $60 billion, about 1.5% of GDP, and it's all capital related. And then, here's the capital projects we're investing in. I think, if we can get to that point with this budget, if the budget passes, I think Canadians will feel confident about those numbers.
But in the interim, there will be a lot of pain. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think the pain is already being felt in terms of the affordability pain coming out of COVID with the higher inflation, particularly food prices relative to wages. I think pain is being felt with respect to the upward drift in the unemployment rate. And I think just, when we look at these business surveys that are produced by the Bank of Canada, the federations of independent businesses, we need something to spear growth. And I guess the government is saying it's got to be capital investment.
Well, Jean-Denis Garon is the Bloc Québécois critic for finance. He joins us now. Monsieur Garon, thank you for taking the time.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
So the government has all but ignored the terms that the Bloc Québécois set out for this budget. I'm wondering what you make of that kind of response from the government.
Well, first I have to say that it's all but a generational budget. It's a budget with a huge deficit, almost 80 billion. And I tend to think that the deficit in the end is going to be larger than that because the minister didn't find all the ways by which he says he's going to reduce deficits. A lot of new spending, and as you said, not so much spending in the right places. And as you know, the Bloc Québécois, we've been very transparent. We've published our demands to the minister and to the government a month ago. There were 6 of them, and when we do the accountancy of that, because at the Bloc we can do proper accountancy, rather the opposite than the minister in his budget, well, we realized that absolutely none of our demands have been met.
None of them have been met, although the budget does set out some provisions that could benefit Quebec, among them the National Infrastructure Program, a Clean Tech Investment Fund, a housing, a recommitment to the Official Languages Act. Are you willing to support the budget on those issues alone? I understand.
Yes. Let us take these things one by one. When you're talking about the infrastructure projects, this morning the prime ministers of the provinces and of Quebec asked the government to invest in infrastructure, in new money in infrastructure, 100 billion over 10 years. When you take away the money that was already there in that budget, we have $9 billion over 5 years. And within this, you have $5 billion for building hospitals. And as you may know, nowadays, you don't even build one hospital from coast to coast with $5 billion. So this is not what we call a big gain for Quebec. When you talk about clean tech, we ask for the abolition of all public subsidies and tax credits to the oil and gas sector. We don't have that. And when you look at the amounts that have been proposed for the environment, and you took away all those rare minerals, all the money that's going to be channeled, the rare minerals strategy, there are $4 million, not billion, $4 million left to protect the environment over 5 years. So I don't know. We can take the elements that you talked about one by one, but that's not what I would call gains. It's rather they're stunts by the minister, but there's no structure plan in there.
So what will the official response be from the Bloc Québécois? We've already heard your leader, François Blanchet, say that the caucus would not support the budget. Is that where it stands now, that you have already decided that you will not be supporting the government in this?
Well, we've been clear. The minister has decided that he will go buy shoes hundreds of kilometers away from Ottawa instead of negotiating. The result is that he didn't show even a minimum of empathy for our elders, for sick people in Quebec, for our mayors who have to take care of infrastructure. And so we have to discuss what we're going to do in caucus tonight. But I don't know if you're a big fan of suspense movies, but on our side, that won't be one tonight.
Not tonight, meaning what? You're fairly certain you will not be supporting the budget?
Well, I don't see how we could. We've been very constructive. And by the way, the demands that what we asked for amounted to between $6 and $7 billion for the whole country. The Quebec share of what we asked for wasn't even 1/2 of a point of GDP. So there was an easy way to contribute to the well-being of Quebecers, to respond to what the Quebec Quebec government asked for and to properly manage the public finances of the federal government. And the Minister of Finance decided to do none of these three things. So what else can we do? We probably won't vote for the budget, and the minister will have to go seek support somewhere else, and I don't know where he's going to find that. That's up to the other parties.
Well, this is a minority parliament, which begs the question then, Mr. Garon, is the Bloc Québécois willing to go to an election so soon after the last one?
Well, you know what? I've seen, just as you did, all those polls that say more than half of Canadians and more than half of Quebecers don't want to go into an election. I understand that, but when you read the exact same polls, what you see is that people also tell us that their priorities are healthcare, affordability, the quality of life for seniors, and that are the priorities of Quebecers. Now we have to make a decision. Myself, and I believe I can speak for the rest of the caucus, myself as a politician, my goal of career is not to remain in my seat at all costs. My job is to use my seat and to use my vote to get things delivered to Quebecers. And if that's not what we get, our job is going to be to not stand up to vote in favor of the budget if what Quebecers need and what Quebecers want is not in the budget. And that is the essence of our jobs as MPs.
Jean-Denis Garon, thank you for this. Appreciate the time this evening.
My pleasure.
As we heard from Monsieur Garon, the budget does contain several line items, among them defense spending, which is the largest single line item in this budget document. There are also changes to immigration, with the Carney government bringing down the target number for permanent residents to 380,000. That is down from the nearly 500,000 in 2023 under Justin Trudeau. And yes, as we heard, the environment, with the federal government expressing a willingness to move away from oil and gas emission caps and lean in on carbon capture technologies. But will this shift on environmental policy be a hard sell for Canadians? I asked that question of Bill Curry, who's the Deputy Bureau Chief at the Globe and Mail, and Jude Amalise, who is the Canada Economy Reporter at Bloomberg. Take a listen to how they answered that question.
Well, it depends which Canadians. I mean, the Conservatives have been calling for that, so Conservatives and their supporters would love to see that. That, I think, is also kind of a carrot that's dangling for Alberta, and those talking about a new pipeline. That's kind of a hint that the government is willing to move on that, maybe if, you know, Alberta and BC can find some way to toughen up their industrial emissions, that kind of thing.
Did you?
Well, I think that for Canadians, they understand that the environment has shifted on climate policy from the U.S. Namely, and there are major fears around the Canadian economy, and so you've seen climate issues fall in terms of priority, like the list of priorities Canadians have, and so I don't know how much backlash the government will have on that. It definitely will face backlash from the NDP and activists, and I mean, in the long run, it seems like we're on track to miss some of our targets in terms of emission reductions, and you see the government de-emphasizing those in the budget. That's when you can start seeing things shift the other way of like, well, this is the government that did X, Y, Z, and now we're missing our emissions targets, and look at the wildfires. So I think that will play out more in the long run, but in the short run, I think the environment is there to move away from some of the Trudeau-era policies that were controversial.
And the full interview with Bill and Jude can be found on the CPAC website. You can also find it on our YouTube channel. Now, we will have more budget coverage in the days to come, and we will continue to follow MP Chris D'Entremont and the news of his floor crossing. But for now, I am Michael Serapio. Thank you for watching our budget special. Up next, Marc-André Cossette et l'essentiel.